Welcome to our first lesson in geometry, dealing with scale drawings and models. These are your guided notes for this lesson. Okay, the first thing I want you to do is open up your notes to this section right here where you see scale factor, and I want you to write down the definition for the scale factor. If we start here, if the scale, drawing, and model have the same unit of measure, the scale can be written without units. This is called scale factor. Okay, so if we have 1 inch equals 2 feet, okay, therefore look at how they are representing the scale factor as its first fraction. Okay, then we can determine the other units. I also want you to be careful because it can also be represented using the semicolon. Remember, the semicolon also can be represented and written as a fraction. So any scale factor that's written as a fraction can also be represented with a semicolon. All right, let's move on. Looking at example 2. The blueprint of a skateboard ramp shows that its length is 11.4 inches. If the scale on the blueprint is 1 inch equals 6 feet, what is the length of the actual skateboard? Okay, here I want you to notice that they give you the scale at which to build the ramp. So if on paper 1 inch equals 6 feet in real life, okay, when we set up our proportion, that first fraction is our scale. Okay, so this right here is going to be the scale at which it gives us the information. So we have 1 inch is 6 feet. So then you have to determine what number of the second fraction is given to us. Well, it tells us 11.4 inches. That 11.4 inches is the drawing representation of the blueprint. Okay, so that needs to go on top because, let me get a different color here. Because this, all the numerators, that's the blueprint. That's what's on paper. Okay? And then all this on the bottom is going to be the actual skateboard ramp. So the question was, what is the length of the actual skateboard ramp? So that's why you have to make sure that the variable goes on the actual part of the proportion. Okay, so when you cross multiply and then you divide, you're going to get 68.4. So that's the actual length of the actual skateboard ramp. Okay, so notice how our scale that they give us is our first fraction. And then once you get that set up, you can pretty much figure out where the third number goes. Okay, try number 2. Read number 2, try and set up your proportion, try to solve it, and press play when you're ready for your answers. You should have set up your proportion with the scale of 1 inch to 8 feet being your first fraction. It doesn't matter which number goes on top or bottom, just as long as the third number that you put in there for the second fraction is corresponding to its appropriate part. So because it says 7.25 inches, it goes on top because it's the map, it's not the actual room. So when you cross multiply and then divide, you actually get 58 feet. Okay? So 58 feet is the actual size of the room in which that exhibit is in. All right. Next, what we have is example 3. And I know I'm going out of order here, but there's a reason for this. So I know it says that you're going to construct scale drawings, but we are not actually physically going to construct them. You just have to have a real-world understanding. So please read example 3, and when you're done reading example 3, push play and I'll help you explain things to you. Okay, the one thing that's concerning about the real world issues here with models is that you have dimensions. You have the 18 feet long dimension and then the 12 feet long dimension. So yes, it's still easy because you're given the scale. However, you just have to make sure that you're doing twice as much as work because you have to split it up into two parts because of those two dimensions. So step one is the length dimension. Step two is your width, which is actually the height dimension. Okay, and this is what we have to go through in the real world when we're dealing with area like this. Okay, unfortunately, we don't have enough time to actually construct scale drawings, but you have to know it for the state test. So let's do number 3. You have your 45 feet long and your 30 feet wide dimension. So what you're going to do is you're going to have two separate proportions. In those two separate proportions, you're going to have the scale as your first fraction. Okay, so set it up and solve it. Pause your video, push play when you're ready for your answers. So we're going to ignore the fact that it says use 1/4 inch grid paper. Okay, all we needed to do was find if we were to measure this on paper, what would those quote unquote model measurements be. So they give you the actual courtyard size. So that's why the bottom, okay, this right here and this right here, that's your actual. Again, over here on the width, those are your actual measurements. Okay, so what you needed to do was figure out the inches. So if we were to draw this up on paper, we would measure out 2.25 inches on paper as the length, and then 1.5 inches as the width on paper. But in real life, that would be representing the real life model or the real life courtyard. Okay? All right. I think we're ready to move on to what I think is the hardest part. I wanted to save this example 1 for last. Because I wanted you to get experience with what it means to have a scale, so you know what we're talking about whenever we are talking about scale. So at this time, on the front of your guided notes, go ahead and pause the video and write down the definitions for scale, model, and scale. When you're ready to move on for example 1, press play. Okay, go ahead and read example 1 about the dragonfly. Read how they set up for the proportion, and then press play when you're ready to resume. So here in these examples, they don't give you the scale, okay? This is where you have to write the scale, and this is why I saved this for last. So you have to set up your proportion, and then your answer has to be the scale representing the model and representing the equivalent actual representation. So it has to be two numbers within the one answer. Let's get some practice and show you what I mean. So read 1A to yourself. It's talking about an World War II memorial and then the model of the memorial. So they give you the measurements of the actual size and of the model size. You just have to provide the scale in which they used. Okay, so this is how we're going to set it up. You've got the actual size and you've got the model size. So I'm going to put the actual size on top. I'm going to put the model size on the bottom. Now, whenever you want to find the actual scale, because they don't give you the scale, we're always going to use 1. In this case, it's going to be inches, okay? 1 inch for our model. And then we're going to find the actual. by doing cross products. Okay, so 17 times 1 is 17, and then divide it by 5. That's going to give you 3.4. Okay, so the scale in which represents the relationship between this model and actual World War II memorial is 1 inch, which represents the model, equals 3.4 feet, which represents the actual size. Okay, so that is our answer because it has two numbers, one being the model, one being the actual. Let's try 1B, read it to yourself, pause the video, set up your, or try to do it on your own, pause the video when you're ready for your answers. Okay, so your proportion, you should have had 16 as the model, for it represented as inches, and on the same level, you should have had the 1 inch to represent your model. So 50 yards is the actual size, so your scale that you should have written as your answer would be 1 inch equals 3.125 yards. If you got a fraction in your calculator, 3 1/8, that would that answer would be good too. You don't have to put your answer as a decimal. You can also represent it as a fraction. But in this case, for every 1 inch that is measured on paper or on the model, okay, that technically is 3.125 yards in real life. Okay? All right, let's go get some guided practice. So this page is technically in your books, but you can just get it from this video. So read through 1, 2, and 3, and let's figure out if we have to write the scale or if they're giving us the scale for each problem before we start solving them. So for number 1, we actually have to determine the scale. So our answer is going to look, is going to have a model representation as well as an actual representation. But for numbers 2 and 3, they give us the scale to use, and that scale is going to be our first fraction. So don't forget number 3, okay, you're going to have to set up two proportions, one for the length and one for the width, okay? So pause your video, do those 3 questions on your own, push play to resume when you're ready for the answers. Okay, check your answers for number 1, 2, and 3. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, we'll get some independent practice from this.